back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. Now, all of this also against the background of the direct U.S.-China relation. There are actually several levels here. In terms of the bilateral issues, or issues that are primarily bilateral between the United States and China, you've now got about a dozen flashpoints of conflict. And again, the background for that is the fact that the entire U.S. foreign policy in the Indian Ocean, and indeed in much of the world, is targeting China, right? You target Pakistan. Why? Because it's the energy corridor for China. You target Iran. Why? Well, primarily, not even among other things now, but number one on the list is that that's where the Chinese plan to get their oil, and they've sealed all these contracts, right? They've bought hundreds of billions of dollars of oil futures looking towards Iran. Then we look at Sudan. Why target Sudan? Why the renewed push to declare President Bashir a war criminal? Precisely because he's another oil source for China. Zimbabwe, Mugabe. Why is Mugabe demonized? Well, demonized for many reasons, but right now primarily on the front burner because this is a source of minerals for China. The same thing goes for Burma, Myanmar. Same thing for Thailand. Same thing for Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. Look across this Indian Ocean, which is a very large part of the surface of the world, and you will see that the U.S. targeting procedure uses such considerations as humanitarian on the one side, now increasingly joined and overtaken by the renewed global war on terror to target Iran, but the actual goal, the reason why they do it, the efficient cause of this stuff is to target China. So if we look at the U.S.-China list of complaints, right, the cahier de doléances, well, what is it? I think we can say there are probably about a dozen issues. Now, this was pointed up this week when the Dalai Lama, this feudal relic, darling of cold warriors and darling of the wealthy mystics of Hollywood, when the Dalai Lama came to the White House, this is yet another gratuitous affront by this feckless clique that runs U.S. foreign policy. The U.S. is meddling in Tibet. The U.S. is meddling concerning Taiwan. The U.S. meddles concerning the Uyghurs of Xinjiang, sponsoring this Uyghur National World Congress of Uyghurs here in Fairfax County. The U.S. is meddling in the South China Sea. This is area that are claimed by a number of countries, China, Vietnam, Taiwan, but certainly not the U.S. But the U.S. is the main one cavorting around this place. You've got the cyberspace question with Google. You've got the human rights issues, right? What's with the dissidents, right? With the U.S. beating the drum on that, right? U.S. supports all dissidents but their own. Economics, now, you're going to have a renewed push by the Wall Street gang to try to break the fixed parity or relatively fixed currency peg that the Chinese have established with the dollar and the yuan, the renminbi, people's dollar. And again, this is because China wants exports and they want the reliability, the predictability of imports and prices. So this is a very important interest. There's also the question of so-called protectionism. Now, this is one where the Chinese are simply wrong. The U.S. needs a good dose of protectionism, but they would see that then as some kind of a measure against them. You've also got, in addition to this, the Copenhagen rancor, the resentment by the Anglo-American elite. The U.S. and the British wanted to strangle the development economically of everybody in the world, starting with India, China, under this Copenhagen carbon dictatorship in the world. And they were defeated, number one, by Prime Minister Wen Jiabao of China. This was a masterpiece of running rings around Obama, tying him up in knots and defeating him. So hats off to China. They performed an important service for humanity by blocking this question of legally binding carbon limits, which was the goal of the Anglo-American world finance oligarchy at the Copenhagen conference. You've also got the question of the DPRK, North Korea, U.S. constantly complaining that China doesn't do enough concerning the DPRK. That's something of a change, because up to now they were glad to have China do anything for them. And then, of course, the sanctions vis-a-vis Iran. And that's where it gets really ugly, because these are areas where you cannot predict what's going to go on because of the many, many players involved. So if we look at all that, I would say that it's more likely that the tensions unleashed by the Taiwan and Tibet business will not be expressed directly vis-a-vis Taiwan, Tibet, but rather in these other areas. And number one among them is the Iran business, right, where the U.S. is demanding essentially that the Chinese commit tremendous act of economic self-sabotage by destroying their relation with Iran by voting in favor of these sanctions, where the Chinese have got $80 billion of development projects. They've got 10 or 12% of their oil now, and hundreds of billions of dollars of future oil locked in, and the plans for the pipeline that the Chinese would like to see go forward. So this is the geopolitics of what's going on in this regard. If you look at the attitude of the U.S. elite, and I've stressed this before, it is a hysteria. It is a hysteria of the British and U.S. ruling class that they can see that China is pulling ahead of them. And I would venture to guess right now, if we did the gross domestic product of the U.S. and China in real terms, real means industrial production, tangible physical production, hard commodity production, infrastructure, and socially necessary services only, you would probably find that China has already passed the United States to become the largest economy in the world. Because remember, when the U.S. comes out with GDP or GNP or whatever they call it, this is largely hot air. Because what do they count in there? The activities of the zombie banks are emphatically included in the U.S. GDP. Derivatives production, of course, it's included. Financial speculation, financial services, a whole series of elements which really have no productive purpose and no socially necessary purpose, but are actually complete speculative hot air and bubble manufacturing. That's included on the U.S. side, whereas the Chinese, of course, the Chinese have this too, but it is a much smaller percentage of what they call the GDP. So, indeed, the Chinese are pulling ahead. And as we'll see later in the broadcast, even Obama brought this up now in his speech on nuclear energy. Now, in terms of the management of the bubble, Bernanke, who has now unfortunately been reconfirmed, and we did what we could to stop that, he is now raising the discount rate slightly. This signals the exit strategy of the Fed. In other words, the emergency measures from the crash of 2008 are now going to be gradually rescinded. So the quantitative easing of the money supply and all the rest of that is now going to be eased. This is not a good idea. On the other hand, he's got to save the dollar. He's concerned with this. Now, in terms of saving the dollar, it is clear and ought to be clear that the speculative attack on Greece and Spain and these other countries in this disgusting acronym, the PIGS group, right? Some great nations, Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, and Spain. Now the bond traders call them pigs. The hedge fund operators call them pigs. Well, maybe that will come back to haunt them. This is a speculative attack. This is where I smell Soros. I smell the sharks of the U.S. hedge fund world and the British hedge fund world, and they are obviously getting together to beat up Greece and attack them. Now, the Greeks are going to try to sell a bond offering next week, and we'll see how it goes. It's known that Goldman Sachs is on the inside helping Greece to hide their debt, but I'm sure Goldman, another part of Goldman, is speculating against Greece at the same time using the same info. Back in a moment.